I believe we are live.
All right. Wow, 15 viewers right off the bat. You have a popular channel, Matt.
Well, thanks. I mean, this is what, our second disputation, yeah?
This is the third total and our second as this group, yeah.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, so we'll just welcome folks who are joining and get started in a few minutes here. You see 15 already watching, Jacob? I still only have one, but...
I see 19 now.
Oh, sweet. Okay. I'll take it. Got a live audience. It's too bad there's no voting feature so that we can determine who actually wins this thing.
Should we get started?
So that we can determine who actually wins this thing. Yeah, hold on. I just accidentally had it pop up live on my computer. Okay. Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Matthew, for hosting us here. This is a dialogue series that Jacob Given and I have been putting together and running. This is our third session in the series. Matt was also with us in our first session, so this is a kind of a round two of that previous discussion. But basically what this is, disputations, as the name suggests, it's modeled off of the medieval disputatio, the medieval sort of scholastic debate series where you have a speaker come forward to argue for a thesis, to argue for a particular propositional statement. They give the thesis, then they will have, 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes, depending, to kind of unpack the thesis, defend it, and just generally kind of substantiate the view that the thesis defends. Then we have two respondents. This time it's going to be myself, Adam Robert, and Jacob Given, who I just introduced. On this session, we're going to have Matt speak first, give his thesis. Jacob will respond. Then Matt will have a chance to respond to Jacob, and then I will come in with my own comments, my own questions, potentially some objections. And then Matt will respond to those, and then we'll have a little bit of a wrap-up discussion at the end, concluding hopefully with a little vote on whether or not we found Matt's thesis compelling. And then we'll wrap up. So I'm guessing we're going to go for 90 minutes to 2 hours or so. We have 2 hours set aside for this. But if we go a little bit shorter, a little bit longer, it's going to be in that kind of time frame. So as I mentioned, Matt is speaking today. He is Dr. Matthew Segall, who I'm sure all of you know, as this is his channel hosting this discussion. Matt is going to be defending the thesis, Contemporary Natural Philosophy Needs a New Theory of Forms. So that's his statement that he's going to be defending. He's going to do this by drawing from the work of the process philosopher Alfred North Whitehead and others. In preparation for this session, Matt also shared with us a paper. It's a chapter in an anthology that's forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. The title of the paper is Standing Firm in the Flux on Whitehead's Eternal Objects. So we will actually be able to link to that paper in the notes to this recording. So we got to read that paper in advance of this discussion, and Matt will be drawing from the paper as well as, his other research, his other writing on the topic of form and eternal objects in natural philosophy. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Adam, for that setup. I will reiterate my core thesis, and then I want to provide a bit of, meta-theoretical context, putting this conversation about form in the context of the evolution of consciousness, because there's a sense in which the realism-nominalism debate can be thought of, in a more or less scholastic way, which I think loses sight of the larger arc of human evolution, whereby nominalism can be understood as serving an important developmental function, but that we've outgrown it at this point. And so that's part of my argument. It's not simply that nominalism is wrong and realism is true, Platonic realism, but that each are developmentally appropriate. And really what we need, and what I think Whitehead provides with his understanding of eternal objects, which I'll get into, is a kind of synthesis position that overcomes the problems with Plato's theory of forms, which one of the things that's important to remember is that all the best arguments against Plato's theory of forms are also in Plato's dialogues, I would say. But we can overcome the limitations of Platonic forms, the limitations of nominalism, while also learning from both of those positions with something like Whitehead's view of eternal objects. And I know Jacob will probably get into Deleuze and his borrowing from Bergson, this idea of virtual multiplicities as a way of getting at the space of possibility beyond what's already actualized, but in a way that's, I guess, more nominalist than realist. Okay, so my core thesis then, just to expand a little bit from how Adam phrased it there, is that I want to defend a reformed process relational Platonism that would entail the reality of an eternally evolving field of universal forms, and that this field of forms is irreducible to, but not ontologically independent of, the historical accumulation of particular facts. So, the context of the evolution of consciousness here is one that I draw from a variety of thinkers, but Rudolf Steiner certainly chief among them, where he would say that the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle were already sort of at the tail end of this, but that philosophy was born with the physiologoi in a way perceiving ideas at work in the world. It was almost as if the intellectual, the intelligible structure of the cosmos was manifest in their direct encounter with phenomena, and that kind of participation gradually began to wane, and the rise of Christianity, and of course this is local to the West, led to an increasing interiorization of thought, and eventually you get the nominalist arguments arising in the scholastic period, which initially had a lot to do with defending the omnipotence of God, the desire to avoid having God limited by the logical structures or any sort of formal structure of the cosmos that somehow was required, and that God didn't have the freedom to create otherwise. And so nominalism originally was a defense of theological power, of divine power. But from Steiner's point of view, what's also going on here is the increasing autonomy of the human eye. And rather than ideas being given and received as if perceived at work in the phenomenal world, more and more human beings began to, again, through this process of interiorization, relate to ideas as something that we construct. Ideas become concepts that we use to organize the world, and this kind of climaxes in Kant, where the human mind and its categories are organizing the phenomenal world, perhaps, but the real world, the realm of things in themselves, is beyond. And so you get a sense that ideas, concepts, categories are human constructs, right? And this rejection of a kind of essentialism and a kind of Aristotelian conception of nature, and the introduction of more, paradoxically, more mathematical forms of reasoning into natural science was a tremendous advance. But I say it's paradoxical because, while modern science is nominalistic, at the same time it relies so heavily on this Pythagorean, mathematical conception of the order and intelligibility of the universe. And so it's not that realism was simply jettisoned, it's that it shifted from this Aristotelian logic of genera and species and a classificatory approach to understanding nature to a mathematical approach. Whereas, especially in biology with Darwin, you got a sense that what we call species is not some fixed essence, but a name that is just a generalization from particulars, and it's really just particular animals and plants and organisms that exist, and species is a name that we come up with to group and classify. So all of this, though, again, the point here is, I think, a process of the evolution of our own consciousness as human beings, moving from this realist conception of ideas that we almost perceive as given in the universe to a sense that, no, we are thinking beings who are creating these ideas ourselves. And so what I'm seeking, by relying on Whitehead primarily, but informed by Deleuze and the important criticisms that he has of essentialisms and Platonisms. Deleuze is thought of as an anti-Platonist, but there are ways in which he's trying to, I think, revitalize Plato's original sense of ideas as something we encounter in problematic situations that require kind of initiation type experience, whereby we become adequate to the problem in the way that Plato would frame that in a kind of agonistic dialogue. And so is Deleuze anti-Platonist or recovering the true Plato? I mean, I don't know. But let me get into Whitehead now, because of, that's where I really want to emphasize my own contribution here and core thesis, because I think he offers the synthesis position that allows us to make good on nominalism without having it be a justification for divine power, but instead nominalism becomes an important response to the historical dimension of reality, that this is an evolving cosmos, and this idea of fixed essences doesn't really work anymore. But at the same time, I think the intelligibility of the universe, one of the preconditions of scientific knowledge, requires that we have some sort of concept of what he calls eternal objects. So let me get into why that is. Very early on in his philosophical turn, after he left after he left mathematical physics and went more into metaphysics, Whitehead publishes a book in 1919 called Principles of Natural Knowledge. And he says the following, and I quote this at the beginning of my paper. He says, "Objects enter into experience by recognition, and without recognition, experience would divulge no objects. Objects convey the permanences recognized in events, and are recognized as self-identical amid different circumstances. That is to say, the same object is recognized as related to diverse events. Thus, the self-identical object maintains itself amid the flux of events. It is there and then, and it is here and now. And the it, which has its being there and here, then, and now, is without equivocation the same subject for thought in the various judgments which are made upon it." So this is in the context of Whitehead trying to provide to unveil the philosophical presuppositions of science. And he thinks that science depends on being able to recognize objects amidst events. He hadn't yet developed the term eternal object exactly, or the term actual occasion, which would become important about a decade later in Process and Reality. But nonetheless, when he refers to objects here, it's basically the same concept that he will later develop and refine as eternal objects. Eternal objects are what recur across various experiences. And without that type of recurrence, Whitehead does not think we could have anything like science, whether it's mathematical physics or any approach to studying nature that would seek invariant principles or laws. Now, what Whitehead is not saying when he defends eternal objects is that the universe as we know it is the result of some fixed eternal set of laws. Eternal objects are not the same as laws of physics. For Whitehead, all the laws of physics and all of the entities studied by physics are historically emergent. And so his concept of eternal objects is not akin to what, say, Newton or Laplace or the mathematical physics out of which natural science emerges in the 17th century. It's not an affirmation that the universe can be understood as governed by fixed laws. His concept of eternal objects ends up having more to do, or what recurs in experience ends up having more to do with the role of potentiality and the understanding that a universe of historical process and a universe that has to be understood as a network of events rather than a collection of uh, enduring material entities in empty space, that we need to be able to make reference to something not already actualized. That while there is historic process and there's an accumulation of facts across the evolutionary history of this universe, there is also something as yet unactualized that nonetheless remains relevant to what has been actualized. And so Whitehead's understanding of a realm of eternal objects is an attempt to make sense of the order amidst this realm of definite possibilities or definite potentials. I don't mean to necessarily equate possibility and potentiality. That is an important distinction for Bergson and for Deleuze. We can tease that out later. But the fact that this realm of unrealized possibilities has a definite order, um, somewhat independent of what's already been actualized, is what Whitehead's trying to account for. In other words, there is a structure to possibility. And when I, in my actual experience, draw or ingress, as Whitehead would say, or I conceptually prehend one of these as yet unactualized possibilities, it comes connected to a whole constellation of other possibilities according to certain definite um, patterns, logical patterns, mathematical patterns, or patterns of value, patterns of relevance, right? And so um, Whitehead doesn't think we can make sense of creative decision um, moment by moment without there being some definite order among these possibilities. And so we can't, Whitehead would say, understand the structure of possibility as such without making reference to something like a realm of eternal objects or definite potentials. He doesn't think that we can just build up a sense of what a form is or what an abstract relation is, that such as those studied by mathematicians, or those studied by ethicists even, just by relying on the past, just by relying on what has already occurred and sort of abstracting from our experience of particulars in the past. So both for understanding the intelligibility of nature and as a presupposition of natural science and the need for recognition of invariant principles across varying occasions of experience, but also for the purposes of understanding metaphysically how we can have something like a field of possibilities with definite relations among themselves. Whitehead defends this idea of eternal objects, the idea of ideas. But he's different from Plato in the sense that Plato made the ideas preeminent. He gave the ideas preeminent actuality, whereas for Whitehead, it is actual occasions of experience that have preeminent actuality. And so whether or not Plato was really a two-world theorist, I don't think that's a fair reading of Plato, though we can come up with a caricature of Platonism that can talk about it that way. Rather than see the physical world and our embodied experience as a pale imitation of some perfect realm of forms, Whitehead is almost inverting that picture. The forms for Whitehead, or the eternal objects, are deficient in actuality. They don't do anything in terms of acting as efficient causes or agents. Rather, actual occasions of experience or living organisms as composed of actual occasions of experience are what have agency and what are making decisions to draw down possibilities from this realm of eternal objects. And the achievement of value is always in that integration of the possibility with what is trying to actualize itself. And so it's, in a way, an inverted Platonism, where concrete experiential events are ontologically prior to forms, but forms as pure potentials are not reducible to concrete experiential events, right? So we need both, Whitehead would say, an account of what occurs, and each occurrence is once occurrent for Whitehead, but also what recurs amidst those occurrences in order to make sense of experience. So eternal objects are real, but deficient in actuality. Anything else I want to add in this opening statement? Let me just look at my notes here. Another interesting part of the context here is that I've been engaged with in dialogue with a biologist, developmental biologist, Michael Levin, who is articulating what he's calling a Platonic research program in biology in order to make sense of what he calls the Platonic morphospace that he believes organisms are necessarily in relationship to. And he's a lab scientist. He's doing empirical work and thinks that without making reference to a realm of forms, he can't understand the ways that what he calls bioelectric patterns in developing organisms can, in a way that seems irreducible to genetic programs. There seems to be a holistic field-like phenomenon that provides the morphogenetic patterning for the growth of organisms. And Levin is actually wanting to attribute agency to this morphospace, that there are, and in fact, I think he wants to attribute all the agency to this morphospace, to this realm of form, and that organisms are, in a sense, just the puppets of this realm of forms. Now, in my discussions with Mike Levin, I've pushed back against that because Whitehead's position would be that these forms do not have agency. I think it's almost like it's an awkward situation to be in as a Platonic philosopher, telling a biologist that they're too Platonist, in that sense that they're, in a way, reasserting this two-world version of Platonism that gives preeminence to the forms. And so I've been trying to both affirm the direction that Mike Levin wants to go in acknowledging that we need formal causality in biology and final causality. We need to bring back a sense of the self-organizing and goal-directed behavior of organisms, not just as a teleonomic thing where it's human beings can't study living organisms except by projecting purposes onto them, but rather a full realist sense of agency in the living world and formal causality, which would entail an understanding of what usually gets talked about in terms of information, but not just this reification of DNA molecules as containing all the information required to print an organism or compute an organism or something, that there are higher level patterns or forms of information than just what's contained in a molecule that we think is special for some reason. So I think that's all correct, and Mike Levin's doing exciting new paradigm work in biology, but the metaphysics needs some work, needs some tweaking at least. And so I've been trying to help introduce him more to Whitehead's way of thinking about this. There's more I could say about the role that God plays as a kind of primary or primordial valuer of the realm of eternal objects, to give them some kind of, to give the space of possibility a kind of vector toward the true, the good, and the beautiful. Whitehead's God is not determining what gets actualized, but Whitehead's God is shaping the landscape of possibility to provide finite creatures with a sense, moment by moment, of what is relevant and what would be most beautiful. But Whitehead's God is not all powerful and can't decide for each actual occasion how to relate to the space of possibility. God just acts as a lure, and a more or less persuasive lure. I mean, that the universe is as ordered and organized and as beautiful as it is, despite not being perfect. That it is as organized as it is, that it is a cosmos and not a chaos, suggests that there is some type of a lure, a divine lure in Whitehead's sense, but not an all-powerful one. So there's also a role that God plays in Whitehead's scheme as not just providing the primordial ordering of this realm of possibility, but is also receiving and integrating what each finite creature decides to do with that primordial ordering. This is the consequent nature of God. And here is Whitehead trying to articulate what I've called an evolving eternity, where because the passage of history realizes certain values, those values themselves are preserved, Whitehead says, in the consequent nature of God. And as a result, eternity is enriched by the passage of time. Whitehead's phrase for this is that um, actual fact casts the shadow of truth back upon the eternal, which is to say, everything that happens, which as it happens is happening for the first time, then becomes what he calls objectively immortal. It becomes part of the eternal nature of God. And so it's a growing eternity, it's an evolving eternity, which requires kind of higher order synthetic thinking to grasp, because it seems like a contradiction on its face. But I think that understanding of the synthesis required here is, something like what Nicholas of Cusa was intimating with his idea of the coincidence of opposites, and that to really think the universe, to think not only about nature and its order, but to think about how it is that we can think about nature and its order. I think we need to be able to go beyond Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction to engage in this kind of integrative dialectic. So I'll leave it at that. And I think Jacob's response is next. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. I want to start by saying I am a reader of Whitehead to some degree. What I always find interesting is I've had Whitehead's Process and Reality and Deleuze's Difference and Repetition sort of sitting next to each other on a shelf for a long time, and I'll pick up one or the other. And when I read those two books, the shape of their thought is so remarkably similar. But the way that certain concepts take precedent in each one, I think, is really important distinction, even if the form of their thinking is very close. But I say that I'm saying that because I have read some Whitehead. I'm conversant in Whiteheadian to some degree. This whole eternal objects thing is something that I've always been hung up on. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to sort of try to get a better understanding of what's going on. I suppose I will begin by just giving my rationale for being suspicious of forms. It's nothing particularly new. I think that, well, it's funny. Matt, you were critiquing a biologist for being too much of a Platonic philosopher. I think I would critique Whitehead for being too much of a theologian. I come from a theology and religious studies department. The eternal objects to me feel like it feels more like a theological claim than a philosophical claim. That's not to say that we can't make the claim or that theology might not be necessary. I guess it just depends on how you carve out the field of theology over and against the field of philosophy. Okay, so one of the things that I think of when I think of why the concept of eternal objects sticks out to me in Whitehead's otherwise, for me, very compelling philosophy is similar to how I think of sort of what Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right? That we somehow identify something as an object when in fact it is actually the objecthood of that thing is emerging from a more primordial process, if I have that right. Now, of course, I'm not saying that eternal objects actually commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, because that is a fallacy that Whitehead himself was very adamant about pointing out. So, presumably, eternal objects avoid this fallacy. I still can't figure out how. And I will continue, and you can tell me exactly what I'm getting wrong here. Two other problems, and this is more in the sort of two-world Platonic view of forms. The appeal to transcendence and the appeal to normativity in the same gesture that happens when we think about a more Platonic view of forms has, we could say, social, political, ethical uh, uh, function of stifling novelty, stifling experiment. All objections that I'm sure you've heard through all sorts of sort of vaguely Platonist thinking. Now, Whitehead will say something that sounds like it's coming from that sort of Platonist side of things, and then he'll say something completely opposite in the same breath. So I'm clearly missing something here. But one of the things that you are pointing it to is this notion of an evolving eternity, right? And that gets me frustrated, I guess, because why are we using the word eternity if there's an evolution in it, right? Eternity, sort of, at least by classical definitions, is unchanging, and it is not subject to mutation, right? But let me then move into sort of my more pointed questions here, and then you can respond to them. Number one, I don't understand the epistemological problem that Whitehead is solving exactly, that can't be solved with a less metaphysically robust theory, or a less metaphysically heavy theory, I suppose. So my reading of Deleuze, I guess, is not, we've been going back and forth on this for a while. I mean, Deleuze isn't, strictly speaking, a nominalist. He's a weird kind of realist. I would accept that. The virtual, right, is a real field of potentiality. But it is a morphing field of potentiality that sort of is generated by the actual, is generated by intensity, and then it kind of creates a feedback loop between what is actual and what's possible, right? So my understanding, and sometimes it sounds like this is your understanding as well, is that actuality produces and alters the field of potentiality. Potentiality is sort of a shifting horizon of possibility, right? And that sort of actual occasions, organisms, whatever we want to say, select from this field the future that they want to incarnate, right? But to my understanding, there's nothing particularly eternal about this virtual field, right? It's simply a sort of real but non-actual other side of the coin in terms of the world historical process, right? So perhaps that has nothing to do with eternal objects, in which case I will ask these two questions. Number one, why are they eternal objects? I've already touched on that a little bit, but why do we use the word eternity? Why not transient abstract objects? Why not? But their transience just happens to rise and fall on a slower time frame than a human lifespan, or something like that. And then the next question is, why eternal objects? Right? Why eternal objects? Why eternal objects? Objects seems to me maybe a misleading label here to some degree. because Whitehead says they divulge no information without the world historical process there to sort of elicit information from them, right? Do I have that right, Matt? Right. So there seems to be no sort of independent being to these things. So I suppose I just need to understand more the nature of these eternal objects, but in particular the nature of the eternity of the object and the nature of the objecthood of the object. The last thing I'll put here is that I just don't understand why abstraction as an emergent capacity of a mind is not. I don't understand why that's not satisfying enough for someone like Whitehead. Um, you don't need to be a classical empiricist necessarily to sort of hold that abstraction and the emergence of like identity depends on the mind, and it just seems odd to me that we need to supply another entity to explain abstraction outside of the mind, if that makes sense. Okay, so those are my basic sort of points of contention on this. And I'm sure a lot of it is just because of my lack of understanding of this particular concept from Whitehead. But I'll give my bigger worry here is that there's a kind of a theological moment or two in Whitehead that I'm comfortable with as a theologian, and that I'm uncomfortable with as a philosopher. So one of the critiques of God in philosophy of religion is this notion of the God of the gaps, right? This notion that, all right, we have certain gaps in our knowledge that we can't quite explain, so we'll attribute to God these powers that we actually don't understand quite how they work yet, right? And to me, I can't help but see that kind of happening here. Whitehead seems unsatisfied with the sort of empiricist view of abstraction. It's not clear to me exactly why. And then he feels the need to introduce new entities into his system in order to explain how abstraction could occur and how objects could endure. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there. I look forward to hearing sort of you address some of these concerns. And I do appreciate the paper and the presentation that you gave us. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. I respond next, or do you chime in, Adam? I forget.
I think we should go with your response, and then I'll come in after.
Great. Yeah, really important criticisms you're raising and requests for clarification, I think also, Jacob. Thank you. I'll start with where you began and ended, which was whether Whitehead is sort of sneaking in some theological or maybe what you mean is almost like religious intuitions into his philosophical arguments about eternal objects. Certainly, he's making reference to God, but at least if we take him at his word, this is an attempt to dispassionately consider at a conceptual level what is necessary to make sense of science and to make sense, as much as to make sense of religious experience. And so in Science in the Modern World, Whitehead talks about how he thinks Aristotle was the last philosopher to dispassionately consider the question of God. In other words, not because of some religious motivation, but really just because of a metaphysical necessity. And that for Aristotle, the metaphysical reason for affirming some type of a divine being was to explain the origin of motion. Whitehead says contemporary physics doesn't have that problem anymore, but it does have an analogous problem, which he thinks he renders in terms of, why something determinately actual should have arisen out of indefinite possibility. And so God for Whitehead plays the conceptual role or the categorical role of accounting for that transition from indefinite, infinite possibility to something determinately actual. Whitehead thinks that, maybe we don't need to call it God. Sometimes I've suggested a different name like possibilitect, the architect of possibility, just to avoid, that still has a theological ring to it, but we don't have to use the G word, which invites the type of criticism you're raising. But I think the scientific project from its origins in the West in the 17th century, and we can broaden what science means perhaps, but in terms of the particular lineage of thought that has led to this search for, physical laws, right, and a mathematical understanding of nature, and has had, miraculous success at doing that, that project would not have gotten off the ground, and this is part of Whitehead's historical argument too, without some kind of a theological background. The idea that the human mind is structured so as to penetrate and reveal the intelligibility of nature, there's a lot of sort of packed into that you need some metaphysical work you need to do to account for how science is possible. And Whitehead thinks that both historically and conceptually, you're going to, at some point, need to make reference to God. He's very critical of traditional theism, of course. God is a creature of creativity in Whitehead's scheme. That's not typical of Western theology. At least, I guess the Gnostics would have a view of God similar to that. But Whitehead's not a Gnostic. But in any event, I think that's what I would say in response to that challenge that he's doing theology and not philosophy. In terms of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness and how it is that eternal objects are not committing that fallacy, Whitehead's point is not that abstraction is unreal with that fallacy. His point is, let's not confuse the two. And he's very clear, eternal objects are not concrete. They're pure potentialities. But they're not, Whitehead agrees, well, I should say, Isabel Stengers agrees with Whitehead. And I love the way that she's able to talk about this in intimate dialogue with Deleuze. They were buddies, that for Whitehead, as for Stengers, abstraction is part of nature. It's not something introduced into nature by human minds. The entire living world, all organisms engage in abstraction just by virtue of needing to translate what's outside into what's relevant to what's inside. And, sense organs evolve as modes of abstraction to filter and differentiate in channels of information that are relevant to the life of that organism. That's a form of abstraction, just as much as, Whitehead uses the example of like the first human being to see the connection between 7 days of the week and 7 fishes made a tremendous advance in this natural capacity for abstraction, which then, can be scaffolded by our symbolic languages and whatnot. And so, Stengers says something like knowledge or words and language do not create abstraction. They require abstraction. They presuppose abstraction that's already at work in the nature of things. So eternal objects as the choice for how to name this category and its function, even if we grant we need a function, why call it eternal? If it's evolving, why call it an object? If Whitehead's a process philosopher and wants to think in terms of events. I've struggled with that as well, but the terminological choice here is because he wants eternal objects to be understood as a category of existence that requires and exists in a kind of polarity or dipolarity with actual occasions. Eternal objects or actual subjects, you could say. So for Whitehead, in the context of his metaphysics, object just means a potential that can be experienced by an actual occasion. Object means potential for Whitehead. So, and why call them eternal? Well, because they don't exist in space-time. Space-time itself requires that we make reference to eternal objects. Space-time is a mathematical construct. Whitehead doesn't think space-time is actual or concrete. He thinks that's a huge error that all of Einsteinian physics has made. That's the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, to think that space-time is something concrete when actually it's a network of eternal objects. What's concrete for Whitehead are the events, the occasions of experience. Space-time is an abstraction from the relations among occasions of experience for Whitehead, right? So I guess that's a very simple way of saying why eternal, because they're not in space-time. And maybe we could refer to what's outside or before or beneath space-time with another word, but eternal seems to work well enough, I think. And then finally, I think Whitehead is and continually affirms that he is a kind of radical empiricist and that he's coming out of the pragmatist tradition. William James is probably the most important philosophical influence on Whitehead, but Whitehead's radical empiricism has a Peircean inflection. So Charles Saunders Peirce and William James were sort of co-developers of pragmatism. James borrows the term pragmatism from Peirce initially, and then Peirce gets upset with James because James is a nominalist and changes it to pragmaticism to distinguish his pragmatism from James's nominalist pragmatism, because Peirce was a realist. Peirce was a mathematical thinker and a scientist like Whitehead. And, there's a longer argument here, and I don't want this to come across as some kind of like elitism or something. I'm not a mathematical thinker myself, but my sense is Whitehead and Peirce felt that James's approach to pragmatism and radical empiricism that just sort of affirmed a kind of easy nominalism was mathematically illiterate, basically. And that the type of reasoning that mathematicians engage in and the possibility of scientific measurement and precision about, again, what is invariant and what recurs across events requires metaphysically something like a realism about form. And then the question just becomes how we make sense of that in a way that doesn't commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness and doesn't imagine form or eternal objects as existing entirely independently of actual occasions or historical process. It's that historical process requires that we make reference to eternal objects, just as eternal objects require that we make reference to historical process. Neither category makes sense without reference to the other, but you do need to make reference to both, would be the Whiteheadian take and the Peircean take. And what's interesting is, Deleuze was very influenced by all these guys too. Peirce, James, Whitehead. And I don't know that I can fully get into it now, but one thing that Deleuze does that I think is consonant with Whitehead is, he tries to emphasize indifference and repetition, the importance of shifting from a transcendental account of knowledge to a transcendental account of learning, a sort of pedagogical transcendental, which in a way is taking experience more seriously and not just arriving at experience with an already formed set of categories, as say Kant does, but really seeing how experience is constantly requiring us to reconfigure our categories. And so there is a sense in which Whitehead's approach to abstraction is rooted in encounters with experience. It's just that he thinks that one of the ingredients in concrete experience is abstract possibility and potentiality. That dipolarity is constitutive of experience. And what it means for an event to occur is that it's both inheriting a past of already actualized events, but also ingressing possibilities which have not yet been actualized, but have a definite relevance among one another that you can't just reduce to what's already been actualized. And I think that's what learning is. That's why Plato's all always going on about anamnesis and recollection, that learning means encountering novelty and experience, but making sense of that novelty, not just in terms of habits we've accumulated from prior experiences of similars, but by dipping into a space or a field or a topos of possibility that can't be reduced to physical stuff or something already actualized in the past. So I don't know if I touched on all your points, but hopefully that gets at some of them.
Yeah, I mean, Adam, did you want me to say something else?
Why don't we hold second responses until I'll give my responses, and then we can just kind of have a more circular exchange after that.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. Thank you both. Thank you, Matt, for laying that out for your paper. Jacob, thanks for your responses too. In the background of this session, we had some preparatory discussions, initial back and forths. Jacob, Matt, and I together. Jacob and I also had a number of conversations about the problems that Jacob was raising in his questions. So I have 3 points that are kind of coming into the conversation in that context, and the first one is going to be really kind of a follow-on to some of your questions, Jacob. I find myself pretty close to Whitehead's position, pretty close to Matt's position, pretty friendly to the idea of the necessity of form, the reality of form. Though I agree, eternal objects is a bit of a troublesome phrase. I like the eternal part, and I'll explain why. Matt kind of already did, but I have a slightly different cut on it. But I agree, eternal objects is a little bit difficult, but I think I can rephrase that a little bit that might be more palatable. I think an eternal object creates barriers to entry that don't necessarily need to be there. So the first one's going to be kind of a follow-on. The second one, I have a question for you, Matt, about the paper. I have a quote that I shared with you earlier already about the nature of human knowing. And then the third one is going to be about, I'm going to take us back to Whitehead's notion of creativity and some thoughts on Whitehead's God. But the first one, Jacob, I take your point seriously that, this is how I read it, at least when you say maybe we can account for the appearance of form or the emergence of forms or the effects or reality of form in the world in a way that on the one hand isn't so metaphysically freighted, and on the other hand maybe doesn't need this appeal to eternity at all. Maybe that's not something we need. There are other ways of accounting for the emergence of form or the reality of form that maybe don't need that kind of explanation. But I think we do. So I wanted to start there on why is eternity important and why is that important for a notion of form. And I read in your sort of challenge, Jacob. This is kind of how I read it, as there's a potential other explanation that goes something like we don't need that eternal realm of form. We can actually give an account of form as sort of bootstrapped and contingent and a kind of effect of the patterned relations or associations of the concrete events and the concrete agents in the universe can somehow give rise to emergent kinds of form that can then be real, but they are, in this sense, they're sort of contingent. They emerge through a contingent evolutionary process, or they emerge through a contingent historical process. They could have been otherwise. It's really almost a kind of accidental view of the emergence of form. And then once a form does emerge and can persist, you could even think about forms in a kind of model of like natural selection. Some of them survive, others don't. You can give this kind of contingent view. And I think we have different versions of that, right? Like I think there's an epistemological version of that claim and there's an ontological version of that claim. And I think Deleuze is, in some sense, and you can correct me, this is not going to be an exhaustive account, but I think what Deleuze is doing is looking at the sort of epistemological version, a kind of Humean empiricism of human knowing, and saying, okay, the ideas that we use that Matt is pointing out are so important for identifying recurring structures, recurring patterns, the sort of definite identities that we identify in the world can be potentially explained on this empirical view as just the human knower, our cognitive faculties' ability to kind of glue together patterns of sense impressions into ideas that we can then sort of pragmatically use to make sense of things around us, right? And I think that what matters there is the contingent patterning of those associations. It seems to me like there should be more degrees of freedom in that kind of thing. It becomes a much more historical and a much more empirical and a much more particularized view of human knowing, right? So we're kind of building up small sense data, small sense impressions, small experiences into the patterns that we then as human beings come to recognize and then maybe forget. We kind of use that structure to create the objects that we see in our first person experience, right? But that whole process could be otherwise on this account, right? Those patterns could come together in all kinds of ways. I think part of what Deleuze is doing, especially if you look at his work on Hume and so on, is kind of saying, okay, that actually makes sense, not just as an account of human knowing, but why don't we use that kind of framework for understanding things like form, things like stable ontological identities in the world? So he's, in a way, kind of ontologizing Hume in a way, right? Is one way of thinking about it. And I think there you have the same kind of thing that you have instead of sense impressions, you have these kind of more basic building blocks of life, of the cosmos, of things coming together and forming these larger patterns, stabilizing into these identities that we then identify as form. But this process, like I said, could be bootstrapped, it could be contingent, uh, it could be otherwise, right? And you can get some ways going that direction, um, to say, okay, yeah, so there are stable identities. There is this kind of definitive whatness that we usually associate with the idea in the Platonic sense. But this is like kind of a historically accidental process. Um, it can go in all kinds of different ways, right? But it's this kind of bootstrap, kind of bottom up view of how forms come to be. And I think what Whitehead is doing is actually a step even beyond that. And because I think to some degree he is on board for the novel configuration, for the evolutionary dynamic, for the creativity, for the essence of that process relational view is that this is in fact what we do see happening. A lot of novel configurations of form coming into being and perishing, new forms coming into being and relating to other existing forms, and those forms are kind of patterning each other in these kind of complex reciprocal ways. And this is kind of what we see in the evolution of the cosmos and in the evolution of life, right? But I think what we're actually talking about is something like the condition of the possibility for those types of combinations. And I think this is what Whitehead is saying. I think this is the more Platonist slant on the whole question. And I think, again, we can do a little bit of analogizing. If you take Hume as the epistemological example, and then you have Kant, Kant is kind of pointing out actually there are a priori structures to human cognition, a priori conditions of possibility for human knowledge. These associations have to come together in certain ways in order for us to have something called knowledge, right? So the associationism can be there. We have, the synthesis of intuitions, all of these forms of intuition. We have these kinds of structured fields in which the associations pattern themselves, and that's less arbitrary. It's significantly less arbitrary, right? That's why for Kant, this transcendental argument. I think if you pull back into the space of ontology, into metaphysics, when Whitehead is talking about eternal objects, he's making the point that there are conditions of possibility even for the emergence of form, or the transformation of form, or the evolution and transformation and perishing of form. But that space is itself not contingent in some ways. There's some definiteness even to that structure. So if you look at these patterned processes that come together to form more complex life forms and so on, that patterning itself recurs, right? Does that make sense? So there's the recurrence that Whitehead is pointing out is present in the definite identity of an oak tree, a whale, the three of us as, particular kinds of human beings. There's that definiteness there. There's a definiteness to the patterning itself, right? So the patterning can give rise to novelty, can give rise to contingent forms, can give rise to all kinds of, relational possibilities. But the patterning there is itself not contingent. And that's why I think this is like kind of a logical statement about the conditions of possibility for the emergence of form. And that's why I think eternal actually is the right word for that. Because it doesn't seem like those recurring patterns change themselves. They instantiate in different ways, and once instantiated, they can combine in, I don't think we've seen, we certainly haven't seen the end of the diversity of life and what evolution can do. New forms are coming into being. Evolution is still ongoing as we speak. The same is true of our thoughts. We can have new kinds of thoughts. Thought hasn't reached its end. We're still in this possibility space of thinking, so the novelty of thinking can still be there. But it comes back to this idea that this kind of contingency or this kind of associationism is not quite deep enough. And that next level, I think, is that you could call it a logical structure insofar as it's us describing it. But I think that you could say there's the field of potentialities has definiteness, right? And that means it also has constraint. So not any kind of combination, not any kind of association is possible. There are reliable recurrences. And I don't think that changes. I think it's a logical structure. It's an eternal structure. So we can maybe hold on to the eternality, and then we can maybe say, okay, objects are more like patterned potentialities or something like that. I'd be happy to swap out patterned potentiality or some definite recurrence of pattern, maybe could be better than object. So that's just a little kind of addition to that conversation. The question I have and feel free either of you to push back on that or add to it or whatever you want to do with that. The two questions I have for you though, Matt, are the first one is again about human knowing. I have a quote for you here that I will read for everyone. This is from Matt's paper. It's on page 17, where he writes, "While it is true that eternal objects grant us knowledge of identities, the us who knows is occasional and not substantial. Our conscious personality is a streaming society or historical route of occasions realizing some definite togetherness of possibilities, but unable to step into the same river as the same subject." And then we have Whitehead's quote, "No thinker thinks twice." So this is kind of a model of like very process-oriented model about the nature of subjects and the nature of knowing. I think the part about the eternal objects granting identity or the whatness, the ability to identify the oak tree across instances, across time and places, and so on, is what's secured there. I'm less convinced that. I'm wondering if maybe we don't think twice. I think maybe we think twice a lot, and I think actually our knowing is rooted in this kind of repetition secured by our memory, and that there isn't there more consistency to our thinking than that? And is that not actually the condition of our being able to think? So I'm wondering if it's a little too hard on process on the knowing side, in that sense from that passage. And then the last question is about creativity again. I'm probably maybe unique in this group, that I think on the question of creativity, on the question of Whitehead's God, I'm concerned that he's not Platonist enough, as opposed to being too Platonist in other places. And this has to do, but I think it's a more subtle point than some people realize. And for me, linchpin really is creativity and the nature of creativity. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about Plato and his famous line in the Republic. I think it's 509b or something around there, where he talks about the good beyond being. The good is beyond ousia, which is sometimes beyond reality, sometimes beyond substance. There's different translations of that word, but it's where we get this sense that whatever the good is, you can think of it in one sense as an idea, but really it's the idea of ideas. And is it actually even an idea like the other ideas at that point? It's something more like I said, like a condition of possibility, maybe, or a condition of giving, even. And I think about that in terms of not just Plato and Whitehead, but if you guys have read Nishitani's book, Religion and Nothingness, he really goes into this question of Plato's good beyond being. And he draws a parallel. He says Plato doesn't go quite enough, but he draws a parallel with what he in his Zen Buddhist tradition calls shunyata, which is the easy translation is emptiness, but it's not emptiness like a lack. It's empty. It's like the luminous emptiness, right? It's like it has a lot of these characteristics that Plato attributes to his son, the good, right? It's something like the illuminating emptiness that makes possible the intelligibility of beings as beings, right? This is what he says. It's kind of a Heideggerian inflection over there. But so I'm wondering, I think if you read Nishitani, I think Plato is actually doing something similar. I think you can do a kind of cool comparative. You can end up with a sort of Zen Buddhist Plato that I think is quite nice. Nishitani says things like, and we can't think of this emptiness as beyond or out there. It's not a two-world thing. He actually says it's nearer to us than anything else. It's on our near side. So there's a sense of transcendence there, but the transcendence is somehow simultaneously like extremely intimate and close, and actually, you could say a priori, I think. It's like the condition of possibility for knowing. So I'm wondering, does Whitehead have something like that? Is creativity that kind of thing? I worry that his emphasis on concreteness and all of these kinds of things. I worry that you end up with a God that's I mean the Whitehead's God is not recognizably a um, a traditional God, like the God of traditional theism that is absolutely transcendent, uncreated, and yet intimately related. That God, Augustine says God is closer to me than I am to myself. Sounds a little bit like Nishitani's Shunyata. It's like this absolutely transcendent thing, but it's also like extremely near. And I'm worried that transcendent part kind of disappears from Whitehead. And I'm wondering, one, could we recover it? Do we want to recover it? I know Jacob has some concerns here. I'd like to hear about those. But does that help Whitehead? Does Whitehead think about this? I'm not sure that he does, and I wonder if I wonder what he would think about all of this, right, theologically, because I think that's an important part of like a robust theology. So those are the 3 points: the uh, conditions of possibility of form, um, the quote about human knowing, and this question of creativity.
Nice. Thanks, Adam. So should we go back to Jacob next?
I think from here we can just kind of go a little bit more freestyle. If you have, Matt, maybe since you got time to respond to Jacob, if you have initial thoughts on what I just said, maybe you start us off, and then we can just kind of go from there.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to keep it brief. I wanted to go back to your opening comments about Deleuze and David Hume's empiricism, Adam, and the ways that, in some sense, what for Hume was epistemological and a skeptical position, Deleuze ontologizes, whereby Hume's account of knowledge formation as rooted in custom and habit gets migrated out into the process of how anything endures at all. This kind of contingent uh, habit or repetition, and I think I I would like to think that Deleuze is partially influenced here by Whitehead, because Whitehead does the same thing in his reading of Hume, when Hume says, I don't see causality when these two billiard balls hit each other. I see patches of color that are contingently connected, and we can talk about laws in that sense, not as causal necessities, but as constant conjunctions of affairs that continue to be constantly in relation, at least as far as our experience is concerned. But Whitehead does something similar with his category of societies, or what indoors. So there's three basic categories in Whitehead: actual occasions, what occurs, and each occasion is novel. There's no repetition of occasions of experience. Each one is uniquely itself, pure, particular, but that nonetheless partakes of the entire universe. And so he plays on how occasions of experience and internal objects can't just be identified with the scholastic categories of particular and universal, because both are both in different ways. But nonetheless, there are the occurrences, the recurrences, or the eternal objects, which can be invariant across events. But then there's endurances, or societies, which for Whitehead are contingently emergent bodies, you might say, but also forms of mind as well. So everything from atoms and subatomic particles, electrons, photons, to stars and planets and galaxies and cells and molecules, animal bodies and animal souls. These are societies or historical roots of occasions of experience, which are not fixed essences. The universe doesn't come pre-made with the periodic table of elements just already there, eternally existent. The periodic table of elements is the result of a historic process of emergence and self-organization. All the laws of physics, as far as Whitehead is concerned, are emergent, historically contingent patterns, right? And so, in that sense, at the level of endurances or societies, he's fully on board with this Deleuzian anti-essentialism, and a historicization of the transcendental. It's just that for Whitehead to make sense of what we mean by such an enduring society, at the level of what emerges contingently in the course of history, we need these metaphysical categories of eternal objects and actual occasions. That's the precondition, the presupposition metaphysically of how we make sense of enduring forms of order in the cosmos. And so it's almost like he's operating at two levels. There's the cosmological level, or in terms of what he calls the cosmic epoch. And he says we more or less live, as far as physics can tell, in the electromagnetic epoch, which is to say that the most widespread laws we have yet detected are the laws of electromagnetism. You can go one layer beneath that in terms of, or wider than that in terms of generality, to what he calls the geometrical epoch. But there are many other ways that the universe could have come to be in Whitehead's sense. But that's the cosmological level. Metaphysically speaking, we're trying to get at what's invariant across any possible cosmic epoch. And there, Whitehead's very careful. He's not saying there's any particular formulation of a law of physics that would be invariant across cosmic epochs, but there is, if we're going to do metaphysics at all, there are some invariant categories that are required for any cosmos, for any world. And he thinks something like events and objects, or actual occasions and eternal objects, definite potentials, if you prefer that, or patterns of potentialities, I think the phrase you were using, Adam. Those are categorical ingredients that are needed to make sense of historical contingent emergence. So Whitehead's trying to have it both ways in a way. It's like, yeah, anti-essentialism at the cosmological level, but metaphysically, we still need definite potentiality to make sense of these contingent ways in which form coalesces into historically emergent patterns. In terms of his theism, yeah, it's not in any way classical, though Whitehead does think it's closer to what he calls the Galilean origins of Christianity in Jesus of Nazareth, and this patient operation of divine love that doesn't wield force tit for tat with volcanoes and asteroid impacts and physical force, but that works through love and persuasion, which sometimes takes longer. But in the end, Whitehead would say, if you're in any way oriented towards this Christ event, you would say, in the end, that patient love conquers all. Conquers in the sense of ends up having wider relevance than physical force. And so whether or not the traditional image of God as a kind of omnipotent dictator is especially biblical, or there are plenty of process relational theologians or open and relational theologians nowadays, like Thomas Ord, who would go back to the Bible, look at the Hebrew, look at the Greek, and say, actually, there's not much justification for an idea of God as omnipotent here.
Mm-hmm.
What gets translated as almighty in the Hebraic context, and Shaddai, is that the Hebrew word? Something like that. Actually means the many-breasted one. And so, if we put this back in context, what we mean by divine power in biblical context, I think needs to be nuanced a bit, and we can recover an even more traditional theism than what gets passed off as traditional theism. But, for Whitehead, creativity is the ultimate principle, and God is a creature of creativity. And the way he frames this in Science of the Modern World is really interesting, because I think it totally subverts any potential criticism that you might get from a Kant or a Heidegger that this is ontotheology.
Mm-hmm.
Because Whitehead says, basically, what is metaphysically contingent can nonetheless be categorically necessary. In other words, the existence of God, that God exists, is an accident. God is the first accident of creativity, the first creature of creativity. But how God exists can then be categorically necessary for all creatures in any cosmos, which is to say, whenever we as human beings begin to reflect on the nature of reality, we do experience creativity without divine mediation, and yet we also experience the divine mediation. And so we experience the realm of possibility, both, again, in a raw sense. We experience creativity directly because that's the nature of our experience. It arises and perishes. We can't step into the same river twice. And I'll get to your point about the knower, Adam. No thinker thinks twice. So we're subject to creativity just like God is subject to creativity. And yet God provides us with a lure or a sense of the good beyond being, a sense of the capital B beautiful that is, in a way, and it's a necessary ingredient in our experience. We experience the world as relevant, and that relevance is, for Whitehead, a function of a divine envisagement of the realm of possibility. And we partake in that divine envisagement, and so experience that relevance, even though we also experience, a synonym for creativity would be chaos. That we also experience this sense of being continually disturbed by the unknown, by the unthinkable, the unprethinkable in Schelling's sense. So God exists as a contingency of creativity, but how God exists is necessary. The structure of the value, the normative, the value structure of possibility, the logical structure of possibility, the mathematical structure of possibility is not contingent. In terms of the good beyond being and the extent to which this theology makes it difficult for Whitehead to affirm something like that, I think in Whitehead's terms, the good beyond being would just mean the good beyond space-time, the good beyond anything already actualized. Not just the good beyond the beings in space-time or the spatio-temporal beings, but the good beyond space-time as such. There is a good beyond this whole cosmic epoch that informs any cosmic epoch in Whitehead. That is the divine function in his scheme. And so I think there's it's analogous to what Plato was saying. In terms of this illuminating emptiness that you draw from Nishitani, Adam, I think Whitehead's account of divine creation is a kind of kenotic account, account of self-emptying, where, the primordial nature of God is deficient in actuality in Whitehead's sense. It's a possibility space. It's an opening with a gradient to it. And it's within that opening, that space of possibility, that a cosmos can be continually created. And so I think illuminating emptiness is a very nice analogy for what Whitehead means by the primordial nature of God and this envisagement of possibility. So I see a lot of parallels there, actually. And Whitehead himself says, look, this process relational account sounds more like Buddhism and Asian thought than it does like anything in Western philosophy or theology. And I think that's borne out in this type of comparison. So, and knowledge. Yeah, Whitehead says directly in his Harvard students record him saying directly that we must discard the notion of a permanent knowing self. So knowing and the knowing self for Whitehead becomes occasional. Consciousness for Whitehead becomes something that arises in the late phase of each concrescence, and that we have a stream of consciousness whereby we remember who we are from moment to moment is a function of the intimate inheritance moment by moment of that stream of consciousness. But each moment is a new consciousness for Whitehead. Each moment is a new subject emergent from its relations to the past and its relation to possibility, and through that to God. The only subject in Whitehead's metaphysics that isn't occasional is God, in some sense. God's concrescence is everlasting, always growing. That's the growing eternity, or the what did I call it? The eternal, the growth of eternity. The way in which eternity can be enriched by the passage of time is because God's concrescence never perishes. Now, some process theologians, philosophers like Charles Hartshorne, most famously, thinks that God needs to be understood as a historical root or as a society. Otherwise, God can't be a person or personality. Interesting debate. I think Whitehead himself acknowledged at the end of the world that his theology wasn't a finished, fully coherent system. It definitely left him feeling unsatisfied. And so that's permission for us, I think, to continue to think through these problems and see what, for us in our time, and again, I really want to emphasize the evolution of consciousness piece that I mentioned earlier, that there's a time and a place for traditional Platonism in that sense of forms as having preeminent actuality, and there's a time and a place for anti-essentialist nominalism, and there's a time and a place for some more integrative higher synthesis. And I think that's the time and place that we're in, and Whitehead encourages us to think with, but beyond him, on these questions.
Yeah. I have a whole sheet of thoughts here. I'll just go over a couple. So I guess one thing that is coming out to me over the few rounds of discussion we've had so far, would it be fair to call the eternal object a transcendental structure?
To the extent that God plays the role of what in Kant is the transcendental subject, like Whitehead's cosmologizing what for Kant remains sort of a meta-epistemological transcendental, right? So I guess yes, but as long as we migrate the transcendental from just the human subject to cosmological or cosmotheological transcendental.
Yeah, and I'm not. Yeah, so that makes sense. Okay, that makes more sense to me, I suppose. I still find it completely counterintuitive that we would call this eternal objects, but given more, how it's been more fleshed out. Yeah, a sort of transcendental structure of possible experience. Um, jives with me a little more. I would say, I guess, so I was reminded in the exchange between Adam and Matt. So the original sort of school of philosophy I came through was phenomenology. I really started out with, so I went I studied at a Catholic university. Um, the Catholics love, Karl Rahner and a lot of those phenomenologically inflected theologians. Um, One of the guys that really captured my attention for a while was Jean-Luc Marion. And he had this saying he had this nice little statement in a lecture he gave. And it, and I think I'm quoting it verbatim. He says, "There is no a priori except the universal a posteriori of the event." Right. And what Marion means there, I think, is that um, the only thing that we can say in advance is that we can't say what will happen in advance, essentially, right? Um, there's kind of an affinity, I think, between phenomenology as a method and sort of radical empiricism to a degree, right? That said, there is a way sort of to get to a transcendental structure sort of from the inside of experience, which we see in Kant, we see in Heidegger, and I think maybe we see in Whitehead, maybe here. Um, so I just wanted to point out that sort of methodological. So I think bringing up a priori and a posteriori as categories here is actually kind of clarifying for me, at least. Um, I guess I'll say two more things and then I just want to ask one question. Um, I lost it. Where is it? Oh, okay. So I guess one of the things I was also thinking of is, so when I'm thinking through the sort of Deleuzian framework of ontological genesis, there are two kind of fundamental principles that you kind of begin with. My reading here is really influenced by a scholar named Joe Hughes. He did a couple of commentaries on Deleuze that I think are really legible. And he essentially says, okay, we start with two principles. We start with the principle of synthesis and the principle of an intensive field, right? So you have intensity on the one hand, which is sort of like a asymmetrical affirmation, right? You could see it expressed as like energetic ways and other sorts of ways. But you have intensity, which is inherently differentiating, and then you have synthesis, which is kind of a gathering, very much based off of that sort of Humean contraction, right? That Humean contracting off differences into a singular kind of moment. He's obviously influenced a lot by Bergson with the contraction of a living present, right? That present, the successive presents are contracted into into memory, right? And we're continually sort of gathering presence into our memory. And then there's this really strange moment in difference and repetition that is very difficult to interpret, but it's the third synthesis of time, the pure and empty form of time. And that is the closest that Deleuze gets to saying something about eternity, I think. I kind of wonder if maybe if we're thinking about eternal objects as a sort of a transcendental structure of experience, I suppose my question is that transcendental structure, does that have more to do with these sort of um, categories of intensity and synthesis that condition the entire process, or does it have more to do specifically with this third synthesis where we move from the past into like into a future where there is the potential for selection, right? So, in other words, there seem to be these sort of atemporal conditions necessary to get motion going, right? Intensity and synthesis. But then there's the moment where the synthesis and the repetition breaks, and then the organism has a selection to make, right? I'm wondering if somewhere in that chain, I'm wondering where you would map the eternal objects onto that, just so I can sort of translate it for myself a little better. And the other thing I just wanted to mention was I'm actually like way less bothered by Whitehead's view of God than I am this notion of eternal objects. I find his view of God less theological than his view of eternal objects. So, anyways, I will toss that over to y'all.
Do you want to take that first, Adam, or
No, you go ahead.
speak last? Okay, it's a hard one. I was hoping you would. Well, it's funny you mentioned Joe Hughes and his reader's guide to Deleuze was something that was important for helping me make sense of difference and repetition. When like Adam, you and I, and some other friends back in the day, where we'd had a reading group on difference and repetition. And this was like back in like 2010, 2011, when the speculative realism thing was happening, and lots of the faculty, the professors involved in that movement were blogging, and graduate students were getting into the fray. And I had an encounter with Joe Hughes, and I think I was a little bit rude because I found his interpretation of Deleuze a little bit too, I mean, you could say Deleuze is a transcendental materialist of some kind, but a little bit too physicalist in the sort of naive sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as if, I think Hughes was saying in the Reader's Guide, look, all this talk of natural science, indifference, repetition, he's just using metaphors, and mathematics is just metaphors. He's not actually trying to engage in a deep way with the ontology of science. He's just taking that for granted and using metaphors to do philosophy and metaphysics in an interesting way. And I completely disagree with that. I think Deleuze is using scientific concepts and mathematical concepts because he's engaging literally in discourse within those domains, and transgressing disciplinary boundaries for sure. But so this movement from intensity to extensity, and where do eternal objects come in? I mean, in my book Crossing the Threshold, I have a whole chapter on Deleuze and Whitehead, and I try to read Whitehead in a more Deleuzian way, but also read Deleuze in a more Whiteheadian way, where Whitehead and Deleuze are both anti-essentialists. Again, at that level of what endures, Whitehead is an anti-essentialist as much as Deleuze. It's just on this question of what recurs that they might differ, though I think when Deleuze talks about problematic ideas, where ideas in that sense belong more to, I think he says, on the side of events, affections, and accidents, or something like that, rather than on the side of fixed essences. As far as how eternal objects function in experience for Whitehead, that's totally right on. They're on the side of events, affections, feelings, and accidents. There's nothing necessary about which eternal objects get actualized in any occasion of experience or across occasions of experience. Those are decisions made by each creature, each actual occasion, each organism. And those decisions are evaluations, where there's a sense of importance that is constitutive of any living creature's experience, but also a sense of adventure. Like occasions of experience are always seeking to intensify their experience, which is to say, to create richer contrasts between what has occurred and what might occur. And so to participate in the production of relevant novelty, not just novelty for the sake of novelty, but relevant novelty in a way that's going to enrich cosmogenesis. So I think a closer reading of Deleuze on problematic ideas helps us get a sense for what Whitehead was at least striving for, despite maybe his more Victorian language choices. And so I do like to give a Deleuzean reading of Whitehead, but I also think that Deleuze, and Stenger has this critique of Deleuze, is prone to, I think she uses the metaphor of like go skinny dipping in the rivers of hell, like just throwing common sense out the window and like let's just really take on chaos and chaosmogenesis and just embrace schizogenesis as a free and wild creation of concepts. And Whitehead's like, well, method is kind of important, and being understood by one's colleagues and by the general public is kind of important, and maybe we should strive for system but remain open-ended. And then the last thing is, you were asking about the transcendental, and there's a way in which what for Kant gets figured as the transcendental unity of apperception that's presupposed by all of our empirical perceptions of the manifold of nature or sensation. And that what we think of as the unity of nature presupposed by natural science is actually coming from the unity of the subject. For Whitehead, again, that gets cosmologized. And so this transcendental unity is the function played by the primordial nature of God. And so Whitehead's not just rejecting Kant, he's cosmologizing the transcendental in a way. And there's a great paper that was originally published in French, but I translated a few years ago when in the Archives de Philosophie in 1993 by James Bradley. It was titled Whitehead's Transcendental Cosmology. And Bradley, wonderful philosopher in his own right, reports how when Deleuze read this article, he wrote him a letter and praised him for what it accomplishes. But he basically offers a Whiteheadian response to Deleuze and shows how Whitehead is not some kind of Platonic essentialist who's at odds with Deleuze's project. But I want to quote one thing here where Bradley's engaging with this concept of difference. He asks Deleuze's concept. He asks, what kind of universal is difference? Difference in itself. And that is to say, I quote Bradley, how can such a concept constitute a theory of the real? And how can such a theory affirm its own truth? He says, Whitehead poses to himself the difficulty within the context of his analysis of occasions in terms of what he calls forms of process, which Bradley says is a risky and characteristically clever phrase which seeks to clarify what is at issue. And so then he quotes Whitehead, and I'll just leave you with this quote. Whitehead says, from this doctrine of forms of process, a difficult problem arises. How can we justify the notion of some general value of reasoning? Indeed, if the process depends on individuals, it varies according to the differences of individuals. Consequently, what has been said of one process cannot be said of another process. The same difficulty is encountered concerning the notion of the identity of an individual conceived as implicated in different processes. Our doctrine seems to have destroyed the very foundation of rationality. So in other words, what for Deleuze is difference in itself, for Whitehead is creativity. Every occasion of experience is new. It's never occurred like that before. And for Whitehead, rationality is recognizing invariance across experiences, right? And so he needs some way of preserving that for there to be metaphysics at all. If we're going to even talk about this shit, we need to justify that. And so that's where eternal objects come from for him. That's the function of eternal objects. And he wants to avoid that old kind of essentialism at the same time that he's making sense of our capacity to do metaphysics, to deal with difference, to deal with creativity, but to also recognize that if we're going to give a rational account, we're presupposing something like eternal objects.
My original thought that I forgot, but you just reminded me of, speaking of creativity and this notion of the good beyond being, the other, and Nishitani's shunyata for sure. The other piece there was going to be about difference in itself, but I felt like the Hadron Collider was a little bit full already. But I do think that is the question for Deleuze that I posed for Whitehead on creativity, is the nature of this difference in itself. I know we're getting close to time, so I'll add one more thought that might help us maybe give some more contrast for Whitehead and eternal objects, and on this question of what kind of modified Platonism it is. Just, thinking about the way you phrased it at the top, Matt. I don't remember exactly what you said, but a kind of reformed, more process oriented Platonism, right? And I think that's part of what Whitehead is doing. And there is an inversion there, right? But I think it's a little bit different. I'm thinking here, I gave Hume as the kind of precursor to Deleuze, which I think is true in a sense. But I think the other person we haven't mentioned, who's maybe even a bigger precursor, is Nietzsche. And I just see so much of Nietzsche in Deleuze's cosmology. And I think especially on I forget where it is, but Nietzsche also describes himself as doing a kind of inverted Platonism. I believe it's The Birth of Tragedy. It might be Beyond Good and Evil, but I'm pretty sure it's Birth of Tragedy. He says that. And basically the image we get there from Nietzsche is the inverted Platonism is kind of, if you want to think about it in terms of images and metaphors, is literal, So in Plato, if you take the cave allegory, you're stuck in the cave of sense, or the cave of sort of images and simulacra of created things, and you're trying to get out into the true world of intelligibility. And Nietzsche is saying, no, we're trapped in the cave of intelligibility, and we're trying to get back out into the free open air of sense. Right? That's one way of thinking about it. And so what he's saying is like the free play of sense, of Schein in the German, is what creates the illusion of the ideal forms, of an ideal eternity, right? So in other words, the whole thing is flipped. So like what's primary is this world of sense, this world of associations, and that we create the fiction of the intelligible world rather than this world being a fiction of intelligibility, right? And that's kind of, I see Nietzsche, obviously he goes in so many directions, but I see Nietzsche and Deleuze kind of taking that reversal as sort of primary and then thinking from there. Okay, if the world of intelligibility is the fiction, it's this beautiful and elaborate fiction. The sort of architectonic philosophical systems of history are, if you think about it in this way, they're like works of art. They're like sculptures. They're just like these beautiful, ornate apparatuses, but they're not real in the sense that like Plotinus took them to be real descriptions of our actual metaphysical situation, right? So that's a kind of inversion. And I'm wondering, I feel like Whitehead is also doing a kind of inversion, but it's not that kind of inversion, I don't think. And I'm just throwing that out there. Like, how can we contrast, Nietzsche in some ways maybe a process philosopher too, but how would you contrast like Whitehead's inversion or modification and Nietzsche's inversion or modification of that original Platonic setup? Because I think they're quite different.
Yeah. I just want to plug, I don't know if it was ever published anywhere, but my friend Peter Jostet Hughes wrote up this little white paper called Whitehead's Nietzsche. One of Whitehead's doctoral students named George Allen Morgan was at Harvard and studying with Whitehead. Whitehead was his doctoral supervisor, and he would later teach Nietzsche, I think, at Harvard. And he gave Whitehead a copy of Nietzsche's Will to Power. And we have that copy marked up by Whitehead. And you can see some of the influence of that in especially Whitehead's last book, Modes of Thought, where he talks about power and really embraces an aesthetic account, though it's already evident before he ever read Nietzsche, but an aesthetic account, an aesthetic ontology, you could say, which I think is one way of rendering what Nietzsche is up to. But yeah, I mean, that sense of Nietzsche's where the idea of the true world becoming a fable or a fiction, and this emphasis on a thesis, and that the Western metaphysical tradition has invented the intelligible world when really all we have access to is our animal experience. And I think that's an important challenge, and I see Whitehead's philosophy as a response to that challenge.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's a fair reading of Plato, for whom philosophy was taught in the gymnasium and wrestling was just as much an important component as geometry. I don't know that Nietzsche's Plato is not a caricature. I think there's a way in which a deeper reading of Plato, where the divided line, say, in the Republic is more a pedagogical maneuver than it is an ontology.
Yeah.
I think is actually there's a way in which Plato was already beyond good and evil. And
right.
And so, what's different in Whitehead, I think, is a retrieval of some conception of an arche or a principle that allows for divine participation and not just Dionysian, but Apollonian. And there's maybe a better balance between these in Whitehead than in Nietzsche and maybe Deleuze too. I don't want to upset the Deleuzians.
No, I think I'll just add quickly. I think you're totally right about Nietzsche's Plato. But I think the Plato that Nietzsche criticizes, one, I think you can make a sound historical argument that Plato is a modern sort of 19th century Plato. I think it has a lot to do with Schleiermacher, his translations of Plato, his teachings of Plato as rooted in a kind of very specific reading of just the dialogues. And then those dialogues filtered through a set of modern assumptions. And so I imagine when I reconstruct Nietzsche's criticism that he is speaking to very specific Platonists or scholars of Plato or receptions of Plato in his environment. And I fully believe that criticism makes sense in that context. But I fully agree on the Plato that you just laid out in terms of the divided line is kind of like it's a kind of like a kind of integrated and variegated complex monism is kind of how I think of Plato actually. It's kind of pedagogical training, the ascesis, the pedagogy, these are different ways of looking at the same one thing from different angles. That's kind of William Desmond's take. Desmond also, by the way, has a funny quote about the good is what's beyond good and evil. If you think of the good as the illuminating capacity for intelligibility, then what underlies good and evil is good, because you've made a distinction, so it has to be illumined and intelligible somehow. That's neither here nor there. We have a couple of minutes, so I wonder if Jacob, you have any final thoughts? Unfortunately, I have a hard stop at 1 in about 10 minutes, so final thoughts, gentlemen. This was great, by the way. I really appreciated this. I'll say again, this was Jacob's idea that he came to me. He wanted to create a container that would maximize this kind of philosophical discussion. I feel like we're nerd maxing right now, but in a really good way, in a really good, productive way. So yeah, thanks to Jacob for suggesting this, and everybody for listening. Honestly, there's 115 of you there. That's cool. So yeah, why don't we do final thoughts and then we can wrap it up?
Yeah, I think honestly, too much to say in a couple of minutes, but the one thing I will say is that I do think bringing up Nietzsche as sort of a I think bringing up sort of Whitehead in the context of Nietzsche is probably more helpful for the types of concerns I have than bringing up Whitehead in the context of Deleuze. Because Deleuze is already synthesizing Nietzsche with a bunch of other thousand things. And I think Nietzsche probably gives a much more distilled and univocal criticism of this of metaphysics, right, and of Plato, whether it's Schleiermacher's Plato or whoever's Plato, right? It's the Plato we have. It's the Plato, or it's at least the Plato that we have inherited, and it's only really been the last 50 years that we've, I think, gotten away from that sort of two worlds interpretation.
Yeah.
At least in the scholarship I've read.
Yeah.
I will say I do have a really hardcore Neoplatonist friend who utterly thinks that the two world interpretation is absolutely the right. So there are two world Platonists out there who are very sophisticated readers of Plato. Anyways, all that to say, yeah, I think Nietzsche is a better figure here, and so I'm going to have to rethink this with reference specifically to Nietzsche, I think. The only other thing I would ask is the only other thing I would say is that the original, I'm looking for the original thesis. Okay, the original thesis. Contemporary natural philosophy needs a new theory of forms. Come back to me at the very end. I'll vote on it.
Well, I want to second Adam and thanking you, Jacob, for the idea for this type of a format. I think it's extremely generative, just for me and for us three, but clearly other folks appear to be interested as well, which is great. So yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, I've tried to argue that there is a evolving field of possibilities, that organisms' minds, as much as bodies, are exploring, feeling into, prehending in Whitehead's sense, and ingressing or incarnating, and that we can't make sense of our experience, we can't make sense of the history of the universe and its varieties of morphogenesis without affirming some sort of an ordered field of possibility. And whether we call them eternal objects, problematic ideas, living archetypes, I mean, maybe it doesn't really matter to me so much, but maybe that's sort of the final joke at the expense of nominalism. It's that, we can rename this function into oblivion, but the very power to coin names itself seems to me to presuppose a shared space of meanings that's going to outrun any particular utterance. The very fact that we seem to be able to make reference to concepts that aren't yet languaged seems to already suggest that nominalism is limited or missing something. Granted, even if we do grant that, we could go in the direction of a kind of virtual multiplicity or the realm of eternal objects. Like, there's still room to maneuver there. But I think, on some level, whatever judgment we make about the realism nominalism question, and whatever wherever we might come down, the fact that we can dispute about how we word things, again, already suggests this underlying field of possibility. And so I think there's so much space to explore in terms of how we conceptualize that and how we language that. But I'm happy as long as we're avoiding a kind of crude actualism where we would think that all that it's legitimate to talk about philosophically or scientifically would be already actualized stuff in space-time, which there's still many physicalists who would argue something like that. And I think science itself requires going beyond that. There's a quantum substratum or emptiness, plenum beneath space-time, according to many physicists. And I think metaphysically, that's the kind of direction one would go if, as a Whiteheadian, that's the direction I would want to go to. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead. What are we doing? Are we affirming? No, we're assenting. I'm assenting to the proposition. I'm agreeing. I don't know if you got Jacob. What do you think?
Yeah, I will. Well, so here's the thing: the actual wording of the proposition is extremely capacious, so I don't feel that I need to assent to any particular view of a theory of forms. I think even in a sort of, if I read Deleuze in a deflationary sort of way, he'd still be accounting for the emergence of forms. So I think I can assent, right? Contemporary natural philosophy needs a new theory of forms. Yeah, I can assent to that proposition. And I have a lot to think about in terms of the differences between a realm of eternal objects and a field of virtual multiplicities. So
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
All right, I got to run. Thank you both. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll post this. We'll post this soon. I think we'll post it on Matt's page. I'll post it on mine. Jacob, I think we'll post it on. Are you posting? Yeah.
I'm trying to.
It will,
I might,
it will show up in.
send it to me. I'll throw it on my page.
Okay, so it will be widely available for viewing, and we're going to continue to do more of these. This was number 3. Yeah, we're off to the races here. I think this is a good format. So stay tuned for number 4 soon.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
See ya.